Elizabeth I emerged from a childhood marked by trauma and mortal danger to become one of England's most skilled political operators. Born to a mother executed for treason, declared illegitimate at age 2, imprisoned in the Tower at 20, and suspected of treason throughout her half-sister's reign, Elizabeth developed survival skills that would define her governance. Her political acumen was genuine, but so were the bodies. Over 600 rebels executed after the Northern Rebellion, and almost 200 Catholics martyred during her reign. This is not the story of Gloriana the myth, but of a ruthless pragmatist who transformed apparent weaknesses into sources of power. Of the real, complicated, very human Elizabeth. Elizabeth Tudor was born September 7, 1533 at Greenwich Palace, a profound disappointment to parents expecting a male heir. When Anne Boleyn was executed May 19, 1536, 2-year-old Elizabeth lost not just her mother, but her legitimacy. Henry VIII's marriage was annulled, making Elizabeth officially a bastard. Her household descended into chaos. Staff didn't even know whether to address her as Princess or simply Lady Elizabeth. Elizabeth's education was extraordinary. By age 16, she was fluent in 6 languages: Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, and Flemish. Her tutor Roger Ascham marvelled, "Her mind has no womanly weakness, her perseverance is equal to that of a man." This intellectual training, combined with observation of 6 stepmothers, including 3 executed or divorced, taught Elizabeth that knowledge was power and that women in Tudor politics existed in constant danger. The most formative trauma came in 1547 to 1548 when Thomas Seymour, her stepmother Catherine Parr's new husband, began visiting 14-year-old Elizabeth's bedroom early mornings in his nightgown. His attentions were absolutely not wanted. On a letter from Catherine to Thomas, Elizabeth scratched in Latin, "Nolito me tangere," "Let him not touch me." When pregnant Catherine caught Seymour with Elizabeth alone, she sent the girl away. After Catherine's death in childbirth, Seymour's attentions returned until his arrest and execution for treason in March 1549. During interrogations about Seymour's plot, 15-year-old Elizabeth demonstrated extraordinary behaviour for her age under humiliating questioning. When told of Seymour's execution, she betrayed no emotion. Elizabeth learned a sustained lesson in survival through self-discipline and the manipulation of appearances. Mary I's reign transformed survival skills into art form. During Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554, Elizabeth was implicated despite Wyatt's scaffold confession exonerating her. On March 18, 1554, Palm Sunday, 20-year-old Elizabeth entered the Tower of London through Traitor's Gate, the same apartments where Anne Boleyn had been imprisoned. While she remained stoic in the face of her imprisonment, it must have been terrifying to follow in her mother's footsteps. For 2 months, she faced interrogation. Released on the 18th anniversary of her mother's execution, she was confined at Woodstock Palace, where she reportedly scratched on a window, "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be," quoth Elizabeth the prisoner. By October 1555, after Mary's phantom pregnancy, Elizabeth returned to Hatfield. She had survived 18 months of imprisonment without ever saying anything that might be misconstrued as implicating herself, a masterclass in saying nothing. When Mary died November 17, 1558, Elizabeth inherited a kingdom £300,000 in debt, roughly around £150 million today, having just lost Calais, religiously divided with her own legitimacy questioned by Catholics. At 25, she had lived through her mother's brutal death, her father's rejection and reconnection, several stepmothers, 3 monarchs, 2 imprisonments, possible sexual assault, and countless brushes with execution. These experiences shaped everything that followed. Elizabeth's first parliament faced a deceptively simple question. What kind of church would England have? The Elizabethan religious settlement has been mythologized as a moderate via media between Catholicism and Protestantism. The reality was messier, a Protestant settlement in doctrine that retained Catholic structure, imposed through political maneuvering and enforced with escalating violence. The Act of Supremacy in April 1559 established Elizabeth as Supreme Governor, not Supreme Head, cleverly avoiding theological claims of spiritual headship. The Act of Uniformity passed the House of Lords by only 3 votes, achieved through imprisoning 2 Catholic bishops. The 1559 Book of Common Prayer combined elements, allowing latitude for different beliefs about Christ's presence in the Eucharist. Archbishop Matthew Parker, chosen partly for loyalty to Anne Boleyn's memory, oversaw the implementation. The 39 Articles of Religion in 1571 established doctrinal boundaries, only 2 sacraments recognised, transubstantiation rejected, papal jurisdiction denied, clerical marriage permitted. Approximately 800 clergy resigned or were deprived by the mid-1560s for refusing conformity. About 300 Catholics fled abroad, and the English College at Douai was founded in 1568 to train seminary priests. But most parish priests kept their posts, and half of all parishes retained Catholic vestments for at least a decade. From the Protestant side came the vestments controversy, when Puritan clergy refused required dress, and the admonition controversy condemning popish abuses. There continued to be tension on both sides. Elizabeth famously declared, "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls. There is only one Christ, Jesus, one faith. All else is a dispute over trifles." But this ambiguity masked systematic enforcement. The 1559 recusancy fine of 12 pence for missing church seems modest, except it was 1 day's labour for a skilled worker, and enforcement intensified dramatically after 1570. The settlement was less theological compromise than Protestant imposition, with enough ambiguity to allow church papists to survive without openly challenging royal authority. The settlement's true nature emerged in its consequences. A Protestant church that would endure, purchased at the cost of almost 200 Catholics executed during Elizabeth's reign, and systematic persecution that drove Catholicism from a majority religion to a faith of small sect confined largely to gentry households. But religion aside, Elizabeth's foreign policy genius lay in using the possibility of her own marriage as diplomatic leverage, while never surrendering independence through actual commitment. Her council debated which alliance would benefit England. Elizabeth ensured no alliance would constrain England's monarch. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in April 1559 ended war with France but confirmed Calais remained French, effectively forever. Scotland emerged as an immediate crisis. Mary, Queen of Scots, used English royal arms, a direct challenge to Elizabeth's legitimacy. The Treaty of Edinburgh in 1560 expelled French forces and required Mary to relinquish claims to England's throne. Mary never ratified it, but the treaty achieved its effect: French withdrawal and Protestant triumph in Scotland. Elizabeth's 1562 intervention in France proved less successful. The Treaty of Hampton Court loaned Huguenots 140,000 crowns and sent 3,000 English troops to occupy Le Havre, officially to protect the port, but actually as security for Calais. When French Catholics and Huguenots made peace, Elizabeth refused to withdraw. The port fell to a united French force in July 1563. The Treaty of Troyes a year later paid England 20,000 crowns less than the original loan. Elizabeth felt betrayed by the Huguenots and would never trust them again. Relations with Spain oscillated between alliance and crisis. The Spanish bullion crisis in late 1568 marked the turning point. When Spanish ships carrying £85,000 in gold sought shelter in English ports, Elizabeth learned the gold was actually a loan from Italian bankers to Spain. She seized it and treated it as a loan to England instead. Philip II, outraged, imposed a 5-year trade embargo. England retaliated by seizing Spanish ships. The crisis pushed England to develop trade routes with the Baltic and Russia, reducing reliance on Antwerp. The marriage question threaded through all foreign policy. Philip II, Robert Dudley, Archduke Charles of Austria, and French dukes all featured as suitors. Elizabeth told Parliament in 1563, "If I follow the inclination of my nature, it is this: beggar woman and single, far rather than queen and married." By keeping multiple negotiations ongoing, she played countries off against each other, maintaining leverage without surrendering authority to a husband or tying England to a single alliance. When smallpox nearly killed her in 1562, Elizabeth asked the Privy Council to make Robert Dudley protector, not a husband, but a trusted advisor who would serve her vision. Elizabeth established a streamlined Privy Council of 18 to 20 members, compared to Mary I's 50+, believing a multitude doth make rather discord and confusion than good counsel. At its centre stood William Cecil, who served 40 years, first as Secretary of State, then Lord Treasurer. His influence was comprehensive. He controlled finances, dominated policy-making, created an intelligence service under Francis Walsingham, and engineered Mary Queen of Scots' destruction. Elizabeth's political skills were formidable. Highly educated and fluent in multiple languages, she could reprimand foreign ambassadors in fluent Latin. She transformed the language of politics into the language of love, presenting herself as spouse or mother of her kingdom. But her famous answerless to Parliament exemplified strategic prevarication. She neither agreed nor refused, wrong-footing pressure from councillors. Parliament met infrequently, only 10 to 13 parliaments during her 45-year reign, averaging 10 weeks per session. Sessions were called primarily for taxation. 11 of them involved money requests. The Parliament of 1572-81 saw an unprecedented 54 prorogations, reflecting diplomatic manoeuvring around marriage negotiations. Conflicts centred on marriage, succession, and religion. In 1559, the Commons raised the marriage question. Elizabeth's response was biting: "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the Kingdom of England." By November 1566, facing a delegation of 60 lords and commons, her response was unusually haughty. A strange thing that the foot should direct the head in so weighty a cause. She compared Parliament to bridleless colts and declared, "My lords, do whatever you wish. As for me, I shall do no otherwise than pleases me." She refused to name a successor, knowing from experience that being a second person meant standing in danger of her life. What appeared as parliamentary opposition was actually Privy Councillors using Parliament to pressure Elizabeth on policies they favoured. But Parliament was characterised more by cooperation than conflict, with only a few MPs speaking in debates. Elizabeth controlled her own policy more than any other Tudor, keeping a tight leash on both her Privy Council and her country. But problems were not restricted to the palace chambers. The Northern Rebellion of November to December 1569 represented the greatest domestic challenge to Elizabeth's rule. Northern England remained strongly Catholic, and Mary, Queen of Scots' presence in England from May 1568, provided a Catholic figurehead and alternative queen. Charles Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, and Thomas Percy, Earl of Northumberland, led the rising. When the Duke of Norfolk was arrested for plotting to marry Mary Queen of Scots, the Earls occupied Durham with 700 soldiers on November 14, 1569. They celebrated Catholic Mass at Durham Cathedral on November 30th, destroyed Protestant prayer books, and carried the banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ. Around 6,000 armed men assembled. But popular support never materialised. Royal forces marched with 22,000 men. On December 16th, the rebel earls retreated, their forces dispersed, and they fled to Scotland. The rebellion collapsed by Christmas. Elizabeth's response was merciless. She demanded at least 700 executions. Approximately 600 supporters were killed, the heaviest judicial death toll of any 16th century English rebellion. Victims were wholly of meanest sort of people. Hardly a village escaped public hanging. These were ordinary people pushing against a way of life that was being pushed on them that didn't benefit them, but Elizabeth was in a precarious position. If she was lenient to them, it would allow a crack in her armour that could be exploited by her cousin Mary. However, no middle ground was sought. Instead, Elizabeth made an example of them as a warning to other would-be Catholic uprisings in her kingdom. The Earl of Northumberland was beheaded at York on August 22, 1572, refusing to renounce his Catholic faith. The Earl of Westmoreland died impoverished in exile. The rebellion's failure convinced Pope Pius V in 1570 to excommunicate Elizabeth, also absolving her subjects from allegiance to her. The bull called her the pretended Queen of England and a slave of wickedness, and commanded people, do not dare obey her orders, mandates and laws. John Felton nailed a copy to the Bishop of London's door and was executed weeks later, becoming a Catholic martyr. The bull arrived too late and had no military backing. Both Philip II and the Holy Roman Emperor disagreed with the approach, but it created an impossible dilemma for Catholics, releasing them from allegiance while excommunicating any who obeyed Elizabeth's laws. The Ridolfi plot in 1571 demonstrated continuing danger. Roberto Ridolfi, a Florentine banker, conspired with Norfolk, Mary Queen of Scots, Philip II and the Pope to assassinate Elizabeth and invade England. Elizabeth's intelligence network infiltrated the plot. The Duke of Norfolk was executed June 1572, and Mary survived for now, although it was another mark against her. Elizabeth chose not to execute her at this time, though Parliament demanded it. Legislative response transformed Catholic persecution. The 1571 Acts made it treason to obtain papal bulls, or say Elizabeth wasn't the rightful queen. In 1581, the recusancy fine increased from 12 pence to £20 per month, a 4,000% increase, approximately 50 times an artisan's monthly wage. It became treason to be reconciled with Rome or to enter the country as a Catholic priest. Before 1570, persecution was primarily for nonconformity and poorly enforced. After 1570, Catholicism became synonymous with treason. By Elizabeth's death, Catholicism had collapsed from a majority religion to a faith confined largely to gentry households. The settlement was enforced through systematic violence that made Catholic survival a matter of wealth, geography, and luck. Elizabeth's early Ireland policy from 1558 to 1572 established patterns of violence and plantation that would define Anglo-Irish relations for centuries. Sir Henry Sidney, Lord Deputy from 1565, mounted campaigns against Shane O'Neill in Ulster, establishing English garrisons and converting clan territories into counties. His controversial cess, an annual military levy, caused major discontent. Sidney extended military severity over ordinary populace, not just opponents. He reportedly joked in letters about killing so many Irish varlets he had lost count. Plantation schemes largely failed. The enterprise of Ulster in the 1570s, privately funded, failed completely and sparked violent conflict. The policy of granting Irish lands to English adventurers intensified Irish hostility while achieving minimal settlement. Military violence targeted civilians systematically. Sidney's forces destroyed crops and livestock to starve rebel supporters, causing widespread famine. English policy by 1572 involved executing any Irishman found bearing arms. The English army rarely exceeded 1,000 men. Elizabeth was extremely reluctant to commit resources. Irish expenditure fluctuated between £35,000 to £70,000 annually. Elizabeth's chronic parsimony meant campaigns were consistently underfunded, leading to longer conflicts and escalating violence. The period demonstrated English forces could not decisively defeat Gaelic resistance without massive commitment that Elizabeth was unwilling to provide. Yet the brutality established precedents. Civilian targeting, starvation campaigns, and plantation as colonial strategy would intensify in subsequent decades, culminating in atrocities like the 1580 Smerwick massacre, 600 soldiers and civilians slaughtered after surrender. By 1572, Elizabeth had survived 14 years against extraordinary odds. She inherited a bankrupt kingdom with questioned legitimacy and religious chaos. She established a Protestant settlement that would endure centuries, crushed the greatest Catholic rebellion of her reign, navigated papal excommunication, thwarted foreign plots, and positioned England as an emerging power. The cost was measured in bodies, over 600 executed after the Northern Rebellion, escalating Catholic persecution, and early experiments in Irish colonial violence. By that time, Elizabeth had also established the patterns that would define her reign: strategic ambiguity, calculated violence, and the transformation of apparent weaknesses into sources of power. Her unmarried status became diplomatic leverage. Her gender, which counsellors saw as weakness, became the foundation for a political persona that transcended conventional categories. She survived because she learned survival from childhood. She thrived because she understood power is performance. It's often said that Elizabeth was less brutal than her father Henry VIII, less fanatical than her half-brothers regents under Edward VI, less bloody than her half-sister Mary I. And by raw numbers, this appears true. Mary publicly executed approximately 283 Protestants in just 4 years. Elizabeth publicly executed around 200 Catholics over 45 years. The maths seems to favour Elizabeth, but this comparison is dangerously misleading. Violence doesn't become acceptable simply because someone else committed more of it in full view. Mary's reign of terror lasted 4 years. Elizabeth's systematic persecution stretched across 4.5 decades, and many of those who died under Elizabeth's hand were hidden from the figures, collateral damage from her policies. Mary's victims were martyrs whose deaths shocked contemporaries and turned opinion against her. Elizabeth's victims were executed as traitors, their deaths legally justified and publicly celebrated. Mary's brutality was concentrated and obvious. Elizabeth's was bureaucratic, sustained, and wrapped in the language of law and national security. The Catholic community didn't just face execution, they faced financial ruin through crushing recusancy fines, social isolation, the constant threat of betrayal, and the slow starvation of their faith as priests were hunted down and killed. By Elizabeth's death, Catholicism had been systematically dismantled from a majority religion to a hidden sect. That wasn't just violence, it was the patient, methodical destruction of an entire community over 2 generations. The fact that it was less bloody than Mary's approach doesn't make it less devastating, it makes it more effective. Both sisters were still Tudors, and this was only the beginning. By 1572, Mary Queen of Scots was still alive, still in custody, still plotting, and still providing a focal point for every Catholic conspiracy. The papal bull excommunicating Elizabeth remained in force. Philip II of Spain was watching, waiting, and growing increasingly hostile. In Ireland, the brutal patterns of colonial warfare were just being established. The worst atrocities were yet to come. The golden age of Elizabethan culture, Shakespeare, Marlowe, the flowering of English literature, would unfold against a backdrop of escalating violence, paranoia, and a surveillance state that would make Walsingham's spy network the most sophisticated in Europe. Elizabeth had survived her first 14 years as queen, but the greatest challenges, the hardest decisions, and the darkest chapters of her reign still lay ahead. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.